Good afternoon. I am Dr. Sarah Abosh Jacobson, Barbara Rabin Chief Education Officer at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I would like to thank you for joining us for the 6th installment of our 2021 Summer Survivor Speaker Series. Today, you will hear from Mr. Bert Romberg, a Kindertransportee who, along with his sister Maggie and mother Sita, fled Nazi Germany for Great Britain in 1938. Bert will share his experiences with you this afternoon. He was born in Astheim, Germany in 1930. When he was 8 years old, his mother made arrangements for the family to escape to England by obtaining a visa for herself and securing spots for Bert and his sister Maggie on the Kindertransport, a rescue mission that allowed thousands of Jewish children to live in England with private citizens during World War II and the Holocaust. Bert and his family were able to move to the United States toward the end of the war and eventually settled in Dallas. Before we begin, I would like to thank our community partners for the Summer Survivors Speaker Series: Cristo Rey Dallas, Jewish Family Service of Greater Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Mosaic Family Services, Refugee Services of Texas, Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. We are extremely grateful for your support as it makes this program possible. Bert will share his story with you, and then we will have time for questions and answers. To ask him a question, please click on the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen and type in your question. We will get to as many of them as we can after Bert tells his story today. Thank you so much, Bert.
Sarah, good afternoon. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to tell you the story of my first 15 years from the time I was born in Astheim in 1930 till 1945, when we immigrated to North America from the United Kingdom, from England. Now we have about an hour, part of which will be Q&A, but we have 45 minutes to tell this story, which is not a very long time to condense into 15 minutes, so please pay attention. The story begins in Astheim, and in front of you, you will see a crude map that we've put together. The blue line, roughly.
One more slide. The right one more time. There you go.
Oh, you'll see the blue line, which is roughly the journey we took from May 1939, just before the Second World War, through northwestern Germany, Holland, ferry over to England, and our life in England, and eventually in 1945 from Scotland across the Atlantic to the New World. Story begins earlier than that. Actually, the picture you see now is a marriage picture of our mother and father. The bride and the groom you'll see there. And this picture was taken in the backyard of our house in Astheim. Astheim, a small place, probably no more than 250 families. It's a village, and it sits in the armpit of the junction of the two major rivers in Germany, the Rhine, the north-south river, and the Main, the east-west river. And it's irrigated by those two major rivers, so it was very rich and prosperous farmland. And we grew up there in a time during the Depression, or right after the Depression, where most of Germany or most of Europe suffered very badly economically. But Astheim and its environment because of the rich and prosperous farms that grew everything from grape and wine and produce to cattle, so that we didn't suffer any of the economic ills that struck the rest of Europe and particularly Germany. Here you'll see our parents' marriage certificate, which is written in Hebrew or an ancient style, Aramaic. And it is, in effect, a contract. It's called in Hebrew a ketubah. It's a contract not just between the bride and groom, but also with the major attendees at the wedding, and specifically the families. And it spells the responsibilities of the parties in this wedding. It's pre-written, and you'll see the different styles of writing where the bride and the groom are named, and at the bottom, the rabbi and the witnesses. And the one on the left is its modern version, which you can buy today for $10 on the internet. Next picture shows you the street in Astheim, and the bottom right is the big house that was the house our grandfather built when he was probably in his very early 20s. He immigrated, or he moved to Astheim as an orphan. He was adopted by a lady called Astheimer, but he kept his original birth name, Rothschild. So on our paternal grandfather's side, we have the name Rothschild, which was my mother's name. The pictures on the top left are more recent of Astheim, but it still is little more than a village. We are in Astheim for some 5-6 years. The chronology of the political situation at this time is roughly that because of the Depression and because of the extreme hardship where families literally couldn't find enough work to keep food on the table, and particularly in the big cities, this became a climate ripe for some kind of revolutionary or radical political philosophies, and political parties of all stripes were competing for leadership in Germany. Eventually, in a democratic election in 1932, the Nazi Party, which had begun earlier, some 5-6 years earlier in Germany, and led by Adolf Hitler, the Nazi Party gained not a plurality, but enough votes to be the largest surviving party from this election. And to gain a plurality, they allied with some smaller splinter parties until between them, they had more than 50% of the vote and took over the German parliament. Early in 1933, Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany, the equivalent of, I guess, our president, and brought with him a very radical, racist philosophy of how to govern. And he promised the Germans that he would bring them out of recession, that if they would follow him, he would lead them to greater glory for the Third Reich. I'm not quite sure which were the preceding Reichs, but he promised that the Third Reich, the Third Reich, and Reich means empire, would last 1,000 years. In effect, It lasted from 1933 until 1945, some 12 years. And during that 12 years, those of you who have read any or know very much about European history or world history, those 12 years spawned the Second World War, which in Europe alone killed some 50 million people. In the Far East, probably again another 50 million people. And in that conflict, the Jewish people were targeted for extinction by the Nazi Party, who very quickly overcame many countries where there was a fairly large Jewish population. Anyway, here are some pictures of my sister and I in our early childhood. The next one is my mother, my sister, and myself. And this picture is taken in Eschwege. And it is probably 1936, late 1935, 1936. We had lived in Astheim until then. My family suffered two major tragedies before then. My sister Maggie was born in 1929. 2 months after her birth, grandfather died. And mother, who was the last of 4 siblings to be living, or his children, the other 3 had left Astheim already to get married or to find a career in the big cities. And mother was left to take care of the business that my grandfather had founded and to take care of her small children and to take care of her then widowed mother, my grandmother. Major burdens, and particularly in a society that the Nazis had quickly turned against the Jews. And we were one of 2 Jewish families in Astheim being vilified, being assaulted by a Nazi party that was strengthening its grip on our village, as they did on the rest of Germany. So during Hitler's ascension and the Nazi Party's ascension to the rule, to the dominant party and the dominant rule maker in Germany, quickly promulgated 2 major edicts in 1933, the first of which is a little difficult to understand, but roughly reads something like this: you good German people should not be dealing with the Jews, who are the enemies of our society. We don't want you to do business with them. We don't want you to socialize with them. And if you are forced to do business with them, if you need to do business with them, pay them as little as possible. And if you owe them money, try not to pay them back. And we, the German government, which is in effect the Nazi Party, will see to it that no policeman, no jury, no prosecutor, no judge will take their side against you, the Germans, in any such dispute. So right there, we lost a great deal of our commercial ability in addition to our social abilities. The other edict, which directly affected our family, was much simpler. In one sentence, it says, no Jewish child will attend a public school. So here in 1934, 1935, my mother is faced with a business that is collapsing, and with no prospect to educate her two little children. So she chose in 1935, end of 1935, 1936, to move us to a town called Eschwege, a rather larger town, a mercantile, a market center town, where her next oldest sister had established a family and where there was a large enough Jewish population to have their own school and their own religious community. And we lived in Eschwege from 1936 through 1938, 1939. And she was right in the sense that we had relatively more freedom. And this picture that you saw of us in the garden of the apartment house where she got us an apartment was taken probably my first day in school, where I went to kindergarten and my sister into first grade. That young chap there is probably one of the only days that he had a nice hairdo, had a clean collar, was clean shaven, and had this cravat that he's wearing, which is a typical uniform for a kid in Germany, first day in school. So I must have been 5.5, 6. So we were okay for for a few months or a year and a half, but then the Nazi philosophy and the Nazi domination and the Nazi local government turned anti-Jewish. And Sister remembers more than I that we were regularly confronted by the neighborhood kids who should have been our friends, but began to bully us. And they would throw our books in the gutter, maybe steal our lunch pails. We'd come home crying, but there was nothing to be done about it because we had no civil defense. Probably the policeman on the block would egg these kids on. So we began to suffer from Nazi persecution. And Mama began to look around to see how we could get out of this very, very difficult climate. It turned out during this time, one of her cousins, one of the attendees at the wedding that you saw the picture, had gone to England with some money early in 1937, early in the 1930s, 1937 or 1936, and established himself and was doing very well, and corresponded with my mom, and she asked him to try and get a visa for her to come to England. And early in 1939, that visa showed up. And it read, we have a copy of it. It read that it was addressed to Mrs. Romberg. It read Mrs. Cedar Romberg, and it had our name, Margaret's name, my sister Maggie, and my name on that visa. But it said to her that you, the refugee, if you come to England and you need to work, and you have to work, you will take no job other than as a domestic worker in a household. In other words, the English, who were also coming out of a depression and had a workforce, an underemployed workforce, didn't want refugees taking their jobs, but they didn't mind importing housemaids for their wealthier families. So Mama was faced with being a housemaid, but two little kids, she probably couldn't get a job there. So she heard about the Kindertransport. Kindertransport, and you'll see on your screen pictures of the Kindertransport. Picture on the top left is probably the port in Holland, the ferry port in Holland, with the kids being led from the train over to the ship. The bottom left is probably very typical of two little children with number tags identifying them, waiting for the boat. And the picture on the right is arrival in Harwich, England, which is the port that services London. And it shows the refugees. We know it's in England because the tall guy on the right with that peaked hat is a typical English policeman, a bobby. Now, let me tell you about the Kindertransport, how this transpired. In 1937, 1938, probably the British newspapers and the radio, there was no television, had stories about the Nazi assault on on the German Jewish population. And they sent a small delegation, maybe 5 or 6 people, over to Germany to find out if in truth this is really going on. Well, these people came back and told their congregations, the Quakers, a small religious sect, told the Quaker congregations that the situation for the Jews in Germany is worse than you're hearing or than you're seeing in your newspapers. And there's no future for Jews in Germany. And we, the Quakers, should try to do something to help these people out. They petitioned the British government, Parliament, to allow refugees to come over from Germany without the formalities of visa applications and without delay. And Parliament said, no way. We've got enough problems feeding our own people. We haven't gotten enough employment. We haven't got enough jobs. And we are subject to the next election. And the labor unions will throw us out of office. But the Quakers allied with some Jewish immigration or Jewish settlement societies in England persisted, and after some weeks of haggling, managed to get a small part of this request granted by Parliament, and it was that you, the Quakers, can bring Jewish kids to England 15 years and younger, because they're not going to steal our jobs. But you'll have to abide by these rules. These children, if they come over here, you will see to it that they will be housed, they will be fed, they will be clothed, and they will be schooled at no cost to the British Treasury. In other words, you'll see that they get foster homes, you'll see they get taken care of, but we don't want to pay the bill. You will pay the bill one way or another. And the Quakers, desperate by this time to have some positive effect, agreed. And they arranged for trains to be stationed at locations, 4 major locations where there were large Jewish populations. And those locations were in Austria, capital Vienna, in Czechoslovakia, capital Prague. Both having been occupied, and one, actually Austria, annexed to Germany, having a Nazi party stronger or more vicious than the German Nazi party. In addition to Frankfurt, the #2 city in Germany, and Berlin, the capital. And these trains were there at these stations beginning at the very end, December and January 1938, 1939. And they were waiting there for families to bring their kids who would take them to England. And many families who heard about it brought their children, but many families were too far away, either couldn't get there or never even heard about it. And those who did get to the train stations, if they brought 3 or 4 children for the trains to take them to England, were told, only 1, maybe 2, because we, the Quakers, firstly, don't have enough funds, and secondly, can't find enough foster families to take any more children. So you can just imagine what went on these train platforms where the parents right there needed to make a decision. Who goes and who stays? Who goes for some unknown future, and who stays for a known but very dismal and hopeless future? Just imagine that. At the same time, we, the lucky little Romberg family, Sita the mother, Maggie the sister, my sister, and myself, got a visa because that cousin in England had somehow managed to get the government to agree to let Mrs. Romberg and her children come over. So she heard about the Kindertransport, and not having any prospect for work if these 2 little snot-nosed kids had to come along, put us on the Kindertransport, got on the train herself as a chaperone. And there were other chaperones on these trains, but they had to come back because they didn't have a visa. In addition, they were probably being blackmailed by the Nazis. If you don't come back, we've got the rest of your family here. But we got on the train and we took the first leg of this journey via train to Holland, via ferry boat to England. And in June 1939, 2 months before the outbreak of the Second World War, arrived in London. We, my sister and I, were immediately taken to some big hall, which like maybe a youth hostel, where there were cots with adults taking care of the children, taking us to the bathroom, bringing us food, until they could arrange to take us to foster homes. Mother immediately found employment with a wealthy family in North London, and so we were separated from her for the next 6 years. We did later on communicate with her, and we actually saw her on vacation, but in effect, the family lived apart. And Maggie was in a family separate from I, but we were sent to the same town, Coventry in central England. You'll see that on the map. Coventry was at the time, and probably still is, the motor city, a major industrial city. It was where England made its cars, its trucks, its buses, much like Detroit here. And when the war broke out in late August, early September of 1939, Shortly thereafter, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, concentrated on England's major cities to try to knock them out or try to see to it that they couldn't produce war material, couldn't produce tanks, guns, trunks to support the British war effort. And they selected Coventry as the first target. And that was in the late 1940, late 1940. And you'll see we are in 1940. You'll see in this picture the results of a blitz on Coventry. The top left picture is probably a day or two after the blitz, but you'll see that there's a house still smoking, demolished, ruins still smoking. The picture down below is a family sitting in front of their ruined house. In that picture, you see an official document, which is addressed to my mother, and it's dated later, it's dated 1942, but it refers to a bombing incident in London on the house where my mother was a servant was destroyed, and with it were whatever belongings she had. And it is a reparation of several pounds to give her enough money to make up for some of the goods that she lost. And she was able probably to buy some clothing and actually able to buy a ticket to come and see her son for the first time in 2 years. So that, now, in this time, our residence, I'm talking about Maggie and my residence in Coventry. Maggie got the short end of the stick. She landed with a family called Simon, a fairly well-to-do Jewish family, had 2 children older than she was, and they took her in middle 1939. She was with them for 4 years. By the time she was 11, 10 and a half, 11, she was their housemaid. Despite having children older than she was, she literally was cleaning their bathrooms, doing their laundry, etc. But they kept the bargain. They housed her, they fed her, they sent her to school, and they gave her clothing. And she survived. Not a very good deal for a youngster, but good enough she survived. Today, she is a great-great-grandmother, has 2 beautiful grandsons, one of whom just had a baby. So it was a bargain, but she's alive. I, on the other hand, landed with a non-Jewish family called Shepherd, and they were marvelous to me. They embraced me. They were not a wealthy family. The head of the family was a postman, a letter carrier. And the lady, the mother of the family, was a barmaid down the block. And they had 2 children also older than I. Peter was probably 2 years older. Probably by the time I got there, he was 11, maybe 12. And Mary, the older sister, 2 years older than he. So she was 13 or 14. And she was delegated to be my English teacher. Here she had this dumb little kid from Germany with no capacity for English. They didn't speak German, but she was determined to teach me English. And the first English sentence that I learned happened with Mary. The Shepherds had a clock over their mantel shelf. And they kept that clock 10 minutes ahead, like we do when we keep our car clock so we're not late for work, keep it ahead. And she would stand me in front of this clock 2 or 3 times a day, and she would say, now remember, this clock is 10 minutes fast. That's the first English sentence I learned. I realized these English people could put these words together and make a sentence. From there on, for the next very few weeks, I learned, and Maggie also learned English very, very quickly. By the time 3 months came of residence in Coventry, we were speaking literally fluent English. And it's very common that youngsters thrown into an element where they have to learn a language quickly adapt because a kid doesn't want to stand out. And the Shepherds sent me to school. They even gave me piano lessons, which was, of course, their biggest mistake to date, because I wasn't any good at it. Just no good. They just unfortunately wasted their money on getting me lessons. But they did things like this. They invited the neighborhood kids to be my friend, to come over and play with me, or I would be invited to their houses. When one of them would go visit their grandparents in the countryside, the Shepherds would ask his parents to lend me their bicycle so I would learn to ride a bike, that kind of stuff. And they were very kind to me. So I was with them for 3 years. Thereafter, or during that time, when as I turned 12, going on 13, Mama in London realized that I needed to learn for my bar mitzvah. Those of you who don't know what a bar mitzvah is, it's the Jewish equivalent to, I think, confirmation. It's the time in a Jewish family's life when the child reaches 13 and becomes eligible to join the adult congregation. And to do that, we learn lengthy stretches of the Bible in Hebrew. And when we've learned it at 13th birthday, we recite that to the congregation in Hebrew. But Coventry had been severely bombed. And although the Shepherds regularly sent me to Hebrew school, there was no longer Hebrew school because the synagogue had been destroyed. Most likely the rabbi and the Hebrew teacher were in the army or the navy or some service. So there was no way in Coventry for me to learn from my bar mitzvah. And Mama went back to the Refugee Society, asked if they could find a place for me to learn from my bar mitzvah. And they found a place in Hartford, Connecticut. Not Hartford, Connecticut, in Hartford, Hertfordshire, where there was the Jewish orphanage, a prestigious small orphanage evacuated from London to Hartford, which was a rural town north of London. And the orphanage kids were also fostered out to local families, but the town of Hartford gave the orphanage a small, disused, no longer used school building to teach their kids, and both in religious teaching and secular English. And I was fostered there with a family called Pettit, again, a wonderful family, and also attended the school that was being operated by the orphanage. And there I had another stroke of good luck, because being a school out of London, a very rich county, London County, had a series of scholarships where kids at 12 or 13 and again at 15 or 16 could take competitive exams for scholarships which would lead them to higher education in the English school system, which at the time was limited. If you were 14 years old going on 15 and in regular public school, if your parents weren't rich enough or you didn't win a scholarship to get into a higher education, at 15, on your 15th birthday, you were out in the workforce. And you'd go to work as a waiter or a miner or what, a machinist, as an apprentice or whatever. But I, with the orphanage, took a competitive exam, and at the age of 12 and a half, succeeded, got a scholarship, and joined the Battersea Grammar School. Battersea Grammar School. And on your left, you'll see the cover of a yearbook magazine of Battersea Grammar School, which I attended from 1942 to 1945. Battersea is a section of London, a London how do you call it? I guess it's a small section of London, but it had the Battersea Grammar School, which was a higher school, higher education, where I got my early foundation of really concentrated education. It was, for those of you who are in the education business, teachers or students, give you an example of a 1-week curriculum. At 13 years old, I was in a school or in a class that had weekly 3 maths, algebra, geometry, and trigonometry, 3 sciences, bio, chem, physics, 3 English, spoken English, written English, and debating, literature and debating. I was a 12 and a half, 13-year-old debater. English, geography, world geography, civics. We also had, all this was crammed into a school week, which started Monday mornings at 8:30 till 5, and Saturday at 8 until 3. But we also had a day or a half day of sports, which never turned out to be sports because it was wartime. And we were out in the farm. We were sent to farms to dig potatoes or shuck corn or whatever needed to be done, because England's workforce was now in the armed services. But it was a great time for a youngster to grow up. And although we experienced the Blitz and the bombing, but it was a wonderful time, because every time we had a severe bombing, we were out of school for a week or 2 weeks until the windows were repaired and the water system was restored. And we went out and helped with the war effort, either in the farms or collecting scrap iron for the war effort. So we grew up in this very collaborative, friendly environment as an English kid. But during this time, Mama in London was beginning to get homesick for family. And her older sister had immigrated to the United States earlier. and the youngest sibling, her brother, had also escaped Germany along with his new bride, who was a nurse. And the British needed nurses, so they had no trouble going to England. And they eventually went to America. So she had this family in America, and they arranged for a visa to come to America. And the visa came in late 1944. And you'll see on this telegram on the left, a telegram from my Uncle Ernie saying, visa approved by the British government and the State Department is advised. And you'll see this Bert Romberg's British Certificate of Identity issued in 1944, where the British, realizing they had these refugees whose citizenship and passports were taken away by the Nazis. So they gave us a certificate of identity, and it has my mother's picture, her signature, and it actually lists my sister's name and my name. And these stamps that you see are the various ports and cities that we went through on our journey from London to the New World. And you will see, you'll recall from the map. Oh, I'm going back quickly to the map that we went from London through Coventry up through Scotland and boarded a British liner, a luxury liner that was a Cunard liner. It was turned into a troop ship for Canadian troops, and it was scheduled out of Greenock, the port of Glasgow, where the Refugee Society had arranged for accommodations for us to get on that ship. And it took us to Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, along with maybe several thousand Canadian troops coming back from Europe to their home country, Canada. And you'll see the embarkation card and landing card for me, where the embarkation card calls me Master Romberg, and the landing card calls me Bertold, my name, Romberg. And it gives the passenger, it tells you the berth that I was assigned to and where we got off. So here we are, Halifax, Nova Scotia. We took the train from there to Montreal, changed trains again, and in April 1945, arrived in New York to meet our family. And on the next, you'll see we corresponded quite a long time with the families that took care of us. And this is Mrs. Pettit's letter to me in I left there early 1945, and this letter was in date stamped 1967, I think, where we're still corresponding with her, and we did visit with her until she and her husband passed away. So that's basically our story. This is the cemetery where my father and my grandfather are buried in Astheim. And this is a picture of Maggie and I today, fat, sassy, and happy, 91 and 92 years old. Thank you for listening. And if you have questions, please forward them. Please.
Thank you so much, Bert, for sharing your story as always. We do have some questions, but there is still time. If you want to ask a question, go ahead and use that Q&A button. First question, Bert. I know you were very young, but do you remember what it felt like to board that train to leave Germany?
I don't remember that very clearly. I remember being on the train. Maggie has a much clearer recollection of that, and she tells a much more vivid story. Okay. So anyway,
Okay.
Maggie
see.
tells a story of us being on that train with a lot of kids, all of them being sort of scared and going through customs to leave Germany into Holland, and how the German border police would come through the train and literally terrify the kids, but I don't remember that so well. Do you have any other questions?
We do. I'm going to see if the mic sounds better now, I think. Oh, a little better. Okay. I don't mean to turn my back to you, Bert. I'm just making sure the
Okay.
sound is good. Bert, when your own kids were growing up, were you open about your story from the start? Was it difficult to share your story? When did you really start talking about the experiences you went through as a child?
I don't think we talked about it a lot. I didn't make any attempt to hide it from them. There was no reason to hide it from them. Basically taught them or told them about Astheim and about Eschwege. And as they grew up, when they were teenagers or older teenagers, we actually sent them to Europe, or on the way to a trip to Israel, they would come back through Europe. And they visited Astheim before we did, before my wife and I did. So they knew and quite intimately were very, and they have been on me to sort of put all this into writing, which I've not been very successful at, but I have started and actually sort of wrote what I thought was my personal biography up till I was drafted into the Army here. I still have some writing to do because that was when I was 21.
Well, I think you'll have an audience that would be very happy to read that when it's ready,
Okay.
Bert. Our next question, let me see. So we have someone who's watching with their 2 9-year-olds, and they are wondering if you felt like, or if you remember this part, when you were away from your mother, primarily for those 6 years, you didn't see her often. Did you start to forget her at all? They were specifically asking if you forgot what your mother sounded like, smelled like. What was that like?
No. I told you during my presentation that I was with 2 very nurturing families, and they made sure that I was in touch, or they were in touch with my mother. So I knew that she was there. I only recall early on when we first got there, when we were separated from her, maybe a week or so of homesickness, where I was crying. I didn't hurt. I didn't know why I was crying, but I know now that that was homesickness. But after that, I was a busy British kid. And while I was happy to see my mother on the few occasions that she could afford a train ticket to come and see us, and we knew she was there, but we were living apart as a family, Maggie with the Simons and me with the Shepherds, and later with the Pettits. But no, I didn't suffer because she wasn't with us. Put it that way. Okay.
Yeah, it sounds like you had a supportive family who was helping you through that, which is great. You mentioned, Bert, that you had been back to Astheim. When did you first go back, and what was that experience like?
The first time we went back was in 1967. That was like 22 years after we 1967 from 1938, so it's 30 years. There was a family that lived next to us who were very good friends of ours. We visited with them, and we visited with, actually stayed with a lady and her husband who, when she was a teenager, was our babysitter. So it was a very nice visit. There were a few families that wanted to see me, but most of them didn't. They were kind of ashamed. And that was okay. I mean, I didn't have very happy memories of them. So I would rather have dusted it, but I did want to see the house. And they did. And this family that was our neighbors actually did something which is called Stolperstein. It's the word for cobblestones. And in many towns and cities in Germany where Jews had lived, the houses they lived in, the neighborhood got together and made bronze plaques about the size of a cobblestone and put it on the sidewalk in front of the house with our name and our date. And we do have pictures of that this family paid for. My grandmother, her date of birth there, and that she died in a concentration camp. My father, who's buried there. My mother, her date of birth, 1897 in Astheim, immigrated to England and immigrated to America and died in 1973. That's all engraved on that cobblestone on the sidewalk in front of that house. They paid for it.
That's amazing. Is that still there as far as you know?
Yes, and we have
Wow.
pictures of it, but on some other slides.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, Bert, looks like those are all the questions that we have. I just want to thank you again for sharing your story and your family's story. Thank you all for watching today. We have 2 more sessions of our Summer Survivor Speaker Series, so next Tuesday and the following. I hope you'll join us for. Actually, Bert's sister Maggie will be joining us on August 10th. So you can hear the story from her perspective as well. So we hope you'll join us for that. But thank you again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.